Welcome back to the second part of DRR and CCA Basics towards risk-informed and climate-resilient development. The course was put together and is presented by the Swiss NGO DRR Platform. My name is Jana Junghart from Helvetas, and together with my colleague Arabella Filippona from Hex APER, we are going to guide you through this course. After presenting main concepts related to DRR and CCA in the first part, we are now going to look concretely into our projects and programs. And we will ask the question, what does it mean to mainstream climate and disaster risks? And how can we do this practically? We will share approaches and strategies to risk reduction and adaptation, including a glimpse on low carbon development. We are also going to recommend selected tools to use as starting points. Should there be more in-depth questions, do not hesitate to contact us. In the first part, we already looked at the risk equation. What constitutes a disaster is not only the size of the climate shock, stress, or hazard. Exposure, vulnerability, and capacities play an equally big role in influencing who suffers most from the consequences of an extreme. And those are also components we can work on through our projects.
Nothing undermines sustainable development like disasters. This is a quote by the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, and we could not agree more. Risks and development are intrinsically linked and increasingly interconnected, which requires addressing them across sectors. Addressing the root causes of disaster risks and minimizing the losses and damages caused by extremes is therefore integrated in the targets of numerous SDGs. For example, in SDG 1 on ending poverty has a target that aims for building resilience and reducing the exposure and vulnerability of the poor to different shocks and disasters. Or in SDG 11, Sustainable Cities, the targets 11.5 and 11.9 talk about strengthening policies and plans towards mitigation and adaptation to climate change, as well as resilience building at city level. A crucial target if we consider that over half of the world's population is living in cities. Also SDG 13, Climate Action, calls to strengthen resilience and adaptive capacity to climate-related hazards and disasters in all countries. Root causes for climate and disaster risks have been mentioned before, such as poverty and inequality. But a main driver is anthropogenic climate change, driven primarily by our reliance on fossil energy, which increases greenhouse gases and leads to global warming. We know some of the consequences: an increase in tropical storms, erratic precipitation patterns, and longer drought spells. To reduce greenhouse gases, we need to know where they come from which sectors, and where they're produced, during which activities. On the graphic, you see the predominant sources of oil, gas, and coal fueling the biggest polluting sectors, among which are electricity, industry, and transportation. This can also give us the entry points to foster low carbon development in our daily lives and in our programs. For example, through renewable energies, agroecology, mobility, and also food choices. Only if we consider the contribution of different sectors and economic development to the creation of disaster risks will we have a chance at curbing climate change and work effectively on reducing risks, more than we are creating.
So, what does it mean to mainstream climate and disaster risks? It means to systematically integrate them. It happens along all stages of the project cycle and can be translated into an adaptation mainstreaming cycle as introduced by the UNFCCC. We need to have a basic understanding of current and also future climate and disaster risks, assess risks and vulnerabilities in detail, identify adaptation options, prioritize and select them, as well as implement them, monitor, and evaluate them to learn from past experiences. In fact, it means to put on a climate and disaster risk lens and look at your planned strategy, program, and project with specific questions in mind. How can disaster and climate risks affect the success and sustainability of the planned interventions? And how do I reduce the sensitivity? Is the intervention maybe inadvertently creating risks or contributing to further emissions and risk creation? To answer these questions, you could read reports and consult databases. The more localized, the better. Look at climate projections for your location and review your objectives, outcomes, and outputs with the climate and risk lens on. Globally, a number of databases exist that indicate past disaster events, classify risk levels, and help you understand future climate impacts on your region. We have collected them in a publication which is called DRR Mainstreaming Guidance, which can be found on our website. A collection of all references used will also be shared at the end of this course. There also exist many tools to help you with that. We would like to share a tool with you that has been useful for us. It has been developed by SDC, the Swiss Agency for Development and Cooperation. It is called CEDRIC, Climate, Environment and Disaster Risk Integration Guidance. And its light version allows you to do such an initial risk screening we were talking about. By reviewing literature and data and overlaying these with the project's objectives, you may get a feeling whether an in-depth assessment is recommended. To take a first look, we follow these analytical steps. Identify the hazard or the hazards and how often they occur and how big their impacts are. Cedric also invites you to reverse the question. Could my project have a negative impact on the environment, on greenhouse gas emissions, or on disaster risks? This is the impact perspective. Based on this initial check, you can conclude whether an in-depth assessment is needed.
While the screening can be done at your desk, we highly recommend going to the area where you're planning to implement the project for your fully fledged risk assessment. A risk assessment can help you understand risks from different perspectives, communicate risks to different target groups and key stakeholders, and support risk-informed decision-making, including investments. In short, a climate risk assessment guides you through the analysis of the different risk components, answering the questions: what can happen, what can we allow to happen, and what can be done. Your assessment will become more precise and expand towards the planning of adaptation measures and adjustments needed. The CEDRIC Toolbox also offers a module, CEDRIC Operational, during which you can conduct an in-depth analysis of the risk landscape related to the environmental, climate, and disaster risks, and impacts on the planned project and vice versa. CEDRIC Operational helps to select the hazards to address, as well as the identification and prioritization of adaptation and risk reduction measures. For a participatory and community-based approach to risk reduction and adaptation planning, we can recommend POC-DR, the Participatory Assessment of Climate and Disaster Risks. The tool was developed by a group of Swiss and German NGOs, some of which are also members of the DRR platform. The tool allows you to prioritize hazards, understand vulnerabilities in depth, and advance on adaptation planning.
Let's move to step 3. There are so many options of how you could reduce climate and disaster risk, right? How do you assess which option has which effect and which one is suitable? And how can you prioritize? Let's look at the first question. As one possible way to identify and cluster measures to minimize climate and disaster risk for communities, we would now like to introduce the risk staircase to you. The risk staircase is a model for illustrating risk management and was first developed by SDC and further developed by the Swiss NGO DRR Platform. It helps us to systematically think through how to reduce the total existing risk in a community or an area step by step, down to a manageable risk level. The total risk is shown by the height of the staircase. And to identify the total risk linked to a shock or a stress, or overall risks in a community, the risk assessment we introduced before is crucial. Let us look at the different steps of the staircase now. On the top of the staircase, we find measures to prevent risk. So all measures that avoid the creation of additional new risk. What we are talking about here is mainly governance measures, such as the integration of mandatory risk assessments for every new investment in infrastructure or also large-scale agricultural projects. The development and implementation of land use management plans and regulations which can prevent, for example, that a settlement is built in a potentially dangerous area. Or the implementation of risk-informed laws and regulations. For example, the phasing out of fossil fuels and a shift to renewable energies to curb further heating of the planet. As NGOs, we can be facilitators. On the one hand, we can support local communities advocate for the implementation of governance measures which prevent risks. On the other hand, we can support government entities at the local level in the development and implementation of good risk governance and also holding them accountable. The next two steps of the staircase are intended to reduce existing risk. We are speaking of preventing and mitigating impact. Examples of these are building of protective infrastructure, for example, flood protection walls or earthquake-proof buildings. The protection or restoration of ecosystems which have a risk reduction function through nature-based solutions. For example, slope stabilizations through the planting of vegetation to reduce the risk of landslide or erosion. The restoration of mangrove forests in coastal areas to lessen the intensity of storm surges. Such ecosystem-based risk reduction or adaptation measures, eco-DRR or EBA, also bring co-benefits. Fruit trees can bring additional income, and healthy mangrove forests are a great habitat for shellfish. It is important that such structural measures, as mentioned above, are always and also accompanied by non-structural measures, such as awareness raising, knowledge building, and skill development on how to reduce risk. The measures introduced so far are long-term and need to be accompanied by short-term approaches that can directly reduce the consequences of extreme events. This is addressed by the next two steps of the staircase: prepare for response and transfer and share. Preparedness measures intend to increase the knowledge and capacities of communities or of individuals to effectively anticipate and respond in a disaster situation. The goal is to save lives, ensure public safety, and meet the basic subsistence needs before, during, and after an event. Examples of these are setting up early warning systems that are people-centered, develop community risk and contingency plans, and hold trainings for search and rescue and first aid. Transfer and share refers to all measures that formally or informally shift the financial burden of a particular risk from one to many. Let's look at some examples. Facilitating access to insurance or microinsurance schemes, supporting the establishment of community seed, grain, or fodder banks, strengthen solidarity networks amongst community or family members, and establishing emergency funds.
Still, after all the effort of lowering the risk to an acceptable level, a zero-risk society is not possible. There remains a residual risk, which has to be carried by the community and which is illustrated on the staircase by the very last step. When taking this logic to climate change, we are facing more and more limits to adaptation as global warming advances. Financial mechanisms to deal with these residual risks gain in importance. The establishment of a loss and damage fund, which is agreed on by the international community during COP27, gives hope. We have now looked at all the steps of the staircase, but there is one additional decisive factor: the enabling environment. This can mean government support, legal and regulatory frameworks, institutional or financial arrangements, or socio-cultural acceptance. If these are not favorable for the measures taken, they may not be effective in the long term. It is important to keep the enabling environment in mind when prioritizing measures to ensure that they have a chance to be effective for a long time. This is what we are going to look into next. Depending on the scope of your project as well as the available data and resources, different approaches to prioritize are suitable. Basic questions and checklists to analyze selected measures against certain criteria can be very valuable and also help to understand what is acceptable to the local stakeholders. These questions and checklists can be embedded in participatory processes, working with decision-making tools as used in the CEDRIC and POC-DR guidelines, for example. Holistic valuation methods that consider multiple dimensions can be a valuable method to assess the adaptation options from different perspectives. If you plan to compare different measures, such as a dam, agroecological practices, or early warning systems, in monetary terms, a cost-benefit or cost-effectiveness analysis might be the right tool. But be aware, you need to be able to translate the value of the measure and its benefits into a financial equivalent. We recommend this only for larger scale initiatives. It can be very powerful, though, to present the results to local decision makers. CEDRIC and also POC-DR offer guiding questions to support informed prioritization. The DR platform has published a guide for integrating cost-benefit analysis into DR projects and has developed a guide for the valuation of nature-based solutions. Have a look for more details on our homepage. Now, let's look at an example. In coastal Bangladesh, people are exposed to cyclones, but also salinization, which makes agriculture increasingly difficult and impacts also on water quality. Several measures were identified that could address these challenges. Among them are crab fattening and shrimp farming for higher incomes, pond sand filter and solar-powered reverse osmosis for treating saline water, as well as sand-bagged vegetable gardens to protect harvests from floods. Next, these measures were assessed against selected criteria. Does the measure benefit the most vulnerable? Does it enhance adaptive capacity and/or reduce the exposure to climate risks under current conditions? Does the measure consider climate projections? And does it have direct co-benefits? Based on these criteria, the adaptation measures were evaluated, yielding different scores, which can then be further discussed. In this case, solar-powered reverse osmosis was identified as the most effective to address salinization. Again, the result is not the final product, but it is a base for further reflections among key stakeholders and with the target groups, and needs further evaluation against available resources and other factors.
How can we measure progress in DRR and CCA, and how do we define success? Averted disasters and the impact of preventive action are hard to measure. And how do we know that adaptation was successful if climate risks evolve constantly? Monitoring and evaluation faces many challenges related to DRR and CCA. Nevertheless, it is important to make sure that you have a clear objective for adaptation and risk reduction, defined based on your risk assessment, and that you keep tracking to see if you are doing the right thing and if you do it the right way. The indicator toolbox of the platform is giving orientation regarding outcome formulations. And related to the outcome focus, prevention, risk mitigation, preparedness, you will find proven indicators. Also, the SDG targets and indicators can be helpful to develop your result framework of your own project. But never forget, you have to define your goals locally and tailored to your context. So avoid doing copy-paste for the goals and objectives. For indicators, however, feel free to choose out of the toolboxes and lists available worldwide, as long as you choose indicators that really measure your progress at outcome or output level and not anything unrelated. Before we close the second session of our introductory course, we would like to say a few words on the international policy frameworks and how they are relevant for our work, and how you can contribute to the achievements of those frameworks and agreements by systematically integrating DRR and CCA. The Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction was adopted in March 2015 at the third UN World Conference on Disaster Risk Reduction in Sendai, Japan. The framework is a call to action to make the world a safer place. It has 4 priorities, which can also help us to frame the work we do on risk reduction. Priority 1, understanding disaster risk, is about ensuring that policies and practices for disaster risk management are based on a clear understanding of vulnerability and exposure to hazard. Priority 2, strengthening disaster risk governance, means having a clear strategy, strong institutions, laws and budget to ensure the efficient management of disaster risks. Priority 3, investing in disaster risk reduction for resilience includes public and private investment in measures which will prevent and reduce losses. Last but not least, priority 4, enhancing disaster preparedness for effective response and to build back better. Countries report their progress on the implementation of the Sendai framework in the Sendai Monitor. It is also an informative web-based database accessible for everyone, sharing information on progress towards the 7 framework targets aligned to the 4 priorities. And it can give useful information for the planning of country strategies and projects.
The Paris Climate Agreement was adopted in December 2015 by 196 parties at the UN Climate Change Conference COP21. It is considered a landmark agreement because for the first time an international legally binding agreement brought all nations together to combat climate change and adapt to its effects. The overarching goal of the Paris Climate Agreement is to halt the increase in the global average temperature to well below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, and if possible, to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. Linked to the agreement are 2 documented processes that you can access and use for project planning. One is the Nationally Determined Contributions, called NDC. The other, the National Adaptation Plans, NAPs. NDCs are at the heart of the Paris Agreement and form the basis to monitor achievements of its long-term goals. They are mandatory for each country and define the efforts of each country to reduce national emissions. Some also outline efforts to adapt to the impacts of climate change. The NDC reports are a great source of information for project planning and for aligning project goals to national priorities. All NDCs need to be updated every 5 years and have to increase their ambitions. Adaptation efforts can, but don't have to be included in the NDC. A second process, which focuses fully on climate change adaptation, is the formulation of a national adaptation plan. This is a country-driven process where countries identify medium and long-term adaptation needs and develop strategies and programs to address those needs. The progress of these formulations and all documents can be found again on the UNFCCC website. Our actions, lifestyles, and development pathways are accelerating climate change at unprecedented rates and cause widespread impacts. The past years have been the hottest on record, and human influence is unequivocal. As humanity, we do not only have a choice, but also a responsibility to ensure that our projects are risk-informed, climate-smart, and contribute to social justice in order not to further fuel the climate crisis, but instead play a meaningful role in effective and equitable climate risk management. Integrating a climate and disaster risk lens systematically in our portfolio is an important first step not to be underestimated. We need to understand risks and the impacts of our own project to be able to act upon them, and we need to constantly monitor that our interventions remain meaningful, even more so under circumstances of high uncertainty. Climate change is happening, and disasters are increasing already today and even more so in the future. Information and tools are available. Let's use them systematically and make sure that our investments into sustainable development are not undermined by disasters and climate change impacts. We hope that this introductory course has been helpful for you. Should you have questions or constructive feedback on the content, please reach out to us under secretariat@drrplatform.org. Thank you very much.